SciAnts. We get experimental. SciAnts. We're curious, non-judgmental.
This is on Corvids tonight, on the lovely crows. We've talked about crows a fair bit in the past as well, and so we're going to go ahead and jump on that. Here is the title of the paper: Crows Count the Number of Self-Generated Vocalizations. Meaning, in simple terms, crows can count up to 4 vocally. Now, 4 being a very subjective number. So 4 here, what essentially they do, these are carry-on crows. They can control the number of sounds that they produce, and they can count up to 4, and that's in response, you're going to show you in the paper, visual and auditory cues. So right here, kind of the setup that they have. So there's either a visual cue shown, like the number 3, or there's an auditory cue produced, and then there's an associated sound that the bird makes. And so this isn't like the sound like 3, but rather they make a particular sound, and they equate that sound with the number 3. So what this analogy essentially comes down to is that when we're kids, like toddlers and babies, there's a sense of counting in humans, but before we know what 1, 2, 3, and 4 are, we make a word or a sound that represents the number 1, and the number 2, and the number 3, and the number 4. And so the idea here in the paper is that these crows are doing something very similar. So it's not that they're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, but here is a number, and they make a sound that represents that number. So it is called symbolic counting. Squawk, squawk, squawk sounds familiar. Yep. They have a concept of 0. So TF, that is a great question. That has not been shown in this study or these creatures. It has been demonstrated in bees. We know bees have a concept of 0. For our crow friends, we do not yet know that. What was really cool was, again, other animals have been able to be identified that they can discriminate between different numbers of objects and different sounds. But when it's non-human, it's very few that they're able to demonstrate. However, these crows, seems like they have identified the concept of counting in here as well. So what they did was, can they control the number of vocalizations they produce to solve these vocal response tasks? So they trained the crows. Actually, they worked hard. It wasn't just the sound that they would produce, but they trained the crows to produce a number of sounds. So they actually, wanted 3 sounds for the number 3. For a visual cue like here, so it's a colored number, or an auditory cue, which was a distinct sound that they played for the numbers 1 through 4. And each one of those sounds was associated with that number. So the birds had to produce the target number of vocalizations and indicate when they're done by pecking at the number. Is it counting or just making a sound response to an image? To me, counting. So Neil, they made it very clear in this paper that this is that symbolic numerical counting. So like where you have an image and you're learning a number to squawk, let's say here. So for that, I think it's more like an early form of that learning, where it's like the beginning stages of counting and having this association of, okay, if I make this number of sounds, that equates to this number. It's also quite remarkable, Neil, I think, that they were able to indicate when they were done counting by actually like going to touch the image when they were done to indicate, yeah, we've done counting. And the reason they actually did that was because there was a puzzle at the end of it. So if they could solve the puzzle by touching the number, that went to solving the puzzle on there, which I thought was really cool. They also found that these vocalizations and the timing of them could be predicted later on. So that if you showed them the number 3 and they did 3, they learned that the number 4 came next. So they actually could train the birds to know what numbers need to come next after a given number, which I think is really, really cool. That again, they had this almost ability to predict what is the next number that's coming based on what was taught to the birds. And again, y'all, it's a big deal because we know very few animals that can have this ability to count that's outside of humans. And this data suggests it's probably much wider spread than originally thought. There's constantly more and more animals that find this, and it's just, I think, really, really exciting to be able to identify this. I forget who in chat was saying, I think it was maybe Turgis, who was saying that he tried to help a crow and it didn't make it but the neighboring crows saw that that crow didn't make it, and then he was targeted for like 5 years or something. Was that Turgis, y'all? I'm pretty sure Turgis had told us that, which was kind of wild, and to be like, oh my goodness, like that's what's like that level of grudge that's held against them, right? Is kind of, they do TF. They have good long-term memory. Long-term memory, though, is defined different in different creatures, and it's dependent on how long they're able to recall something. The grudges that they've had, like that they mentioned here, are kind of as a aside talked about, so like as an anecdotal evidence, until it's actually demonstrated in a controlled setting. You know, it's a little bit hard to really say like that's like how much of that is one-on-one memory, how much of it is socially learned, etc. So it's something to just keep in mind. And again, the paper is just highlighting more of the breadth and depth of the knowledge of these creatures that we didn't account for before. That's one of the points of the paper too, about identifying this species, that the fact that it can be able to count, what that might mean for other creatures too. Intelligence. Remember, the point of the paper is they demonstrated that these creatures can count, and that counting is really quite special of how are they able to do, like associate a vocal call with a visual numerical cue that you can train these animals to do. So let's just, again, I think it's a nice way to round out their intelligence on this puzzle box. So yeah, just a summary of this. This paper was published in the journal SciAnts, and again, it was looking at how crows can control the number of sounds that they make, and then they can count up to 4 that is in response to both visual and auditory cues. So the bird is shown a visual cue of a number. They were trained to make a certain number of calls equivalent to whatever that number is. So number 2 got 2 calls. They were even trained to touch the number once they were done making these calls, and so it's symbolic counting that these animals were able to do. And it's really, really remarkable. They did do further analysis about the timing and the different acoustic features within the sounds that they're making. So there's not only the different numbers, and I thought this was a really neat part. It's not only that they're making a different number of sounds for the number that they're being trained on, but the acoustics is also different. So there's like subtext to the differences in the calls, which again is really exciting. So y'all, that was the third SciAnts news story of the night. We talked about counting crows, not the band, but crows actually doing the counting. So guys, we'll end it there.